I sat across from Lorraine at our favorite brunch spot, the one with the big windows and the smell of fresh coffee always hanging in the air. 12 years of marriage, and there she was, sliding divorce papers across the table like they were a menu special. She had this little smirk on her face, like she'd just won something big. I didn't expect it, not the papers, not the smirk, not the way she leaned back in her chair, so sure of herself. She'd always been cunning, sure, but this was a new level, even for her. The sunlight caught her blonde hair as she sipped her mimosa, acting like nothing was wrong. Next to her sat Carter, her new guy, all muscles and a shiny watch he kept tilting so everyone could see it. He grinned at me, like he was in on some joke I didn't get yet. The papers sat there between us, crisp and white, a neat little stack that spelled out the end. I didn't pick them up right away. I just stared at them, then at her, trying to figure out when she'd turned into this person. 12 years, building a life, a home, memories, and she was tossing it all like it was nothing, like day-old toast you leave on the counter. I could feel the waitress hovering nearby, probably wondering why the mood at our table had gone so cold. Lorraine didn't care. She just kept that smirk, waiting for me to react, maybe hoping I'd yell or beg or make a scene. But I didn't. I wasn't going to give her that. "You're really doing this here?" I asked, keeping my voice low steady. The clatter of plates and chatter from other tables filled the silence she left. She shrugged, like it was no big deal, and said, "It's as good a place as any, Miles." Miles. She hadn't called me that in years. Usually it was honey or babe, back when things were softer between us. Now it was Miles, like I was just some guy she used to know. Carter chuckled, flexing his arm a little as he reached for his coffee, showing off like that made him better than me. I wanted to knock that stupid watch off his wrist, but I didn't move. I just sat there, letting it sink in. The papers had her signature already, bold and loopy, the way she always signed things. She'd planned this, probably for weeks, maybe months. I thought about the last few years, how she'd started staying out later, how she'd stopped asking about my day, how she'd roll her eyes when I talked about work. I chalked it up to stress, to us drifting a little. But this wasn't drifting. This was her jumping ship, and Carter was the lifeboat she'd picked. I wondered what he had that I didn't. Money? Looks? A louder laugh? Whatever it was, she thought it was enough to replace what we'd built. I picked up the pin the waitress had left with the bill. Lorraine's eyes flicked to it, and her smirk grew, like she'd won already. She probably thought I'd fight, drag this out, give her the messy divorce she could brag about to her friends. But I wasn't in the mood for her games. I signed the receipt for brunch. Pancakes, eggs, her mimosa, the whole stupid meal, and slid it back across the table. "See you in court," I said, looking right at her. No yelling, no pleading, just those 4 words. Her smirk faltered for a second, just a tiny crack, but I saw it. Carter shifted in his seat, like he wasn't sure what to do now that I wasn't playing along. I stood up, dropped some cash on the table, more than enough to cover it, and walked out. The bell above the door jingled as I left, and I could feel their eyes on my back. Outside, the air was cool, sharper than I expected, and I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Lorraine thought she'd caught me off guard, thought she'd humiliated me in our favorite spot. But she didn't know me as well as she thought. She never had. I'd spent years building something bigger than she could imagine, and if she wanted to walk away with Carter and his flashy watch, that was fine. She'd find out soon enough what she was really leaving behind. The street was busy, people walking past with shopping bags and dogs on leashes, living their normal Sunday mornings. I shoved my hands in my pockets and started toward my car, the divorce papers still sitting on that table in my mind. I wasn't mad, not yet. I was just awake. For the first time in a long time, I felt awake. Lorraine thought this was her move, her big play. But she didn't know the board we were playing on. Not yet. I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled out into traffic. The radio hummed something low and steady, and I let it wash over me as I drove. She wanted a fight? She'd get one. But it wasn't going to look anything like she expected. I thought about calling Jules, my best friend, the guy who'd been with me since we were kids scraping by with nothing. He'd know what to say, probably tell me to laugh it off and keep moving. But I didn't call him yet. I just drove, letting the city blur past, replaying that smirk in my head. Lorraine thought she'd won. Carter thought he'd replaced me. They were wrong. This wasn't the end of anything, not for me. It was just the beginning. And by the time they figured that out, it'd be too late. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter and turned toward home. Time to start planning. I sat in my office the next day, The divorce papers Lorraine had served me still fresh in my mind, but I wasn't crumbling, not the way she probably hoped. The room was quiet, just the hum of the city outside my window and the soft ticking of the clock on my desk. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how she'd underestimated me all these years. Let her think I was just another guy she could bleed dry in a courtroom, some boring strategist who shuffled money around and called it a living. That's what she'd always said. Anyway, half teasing, half serious, like my work was some dull game she didn't care to understand. If only she knew how much power I really held, how deep the roots of my world went. She'd picked the wrong fight this time. The truth was, I owned a lot more than she realized. Years ago, back when we were still happy, or at least pretending to be, I'd quietly bought Winston & Bright LLP, the law firm she'd hired to tear me apart. It wasn't some big, dramatic takeover you'd see in a movie. I did it through a shell company tied to my family's trust, a move so under the radar even Jules had raised an eyebrow when I told him. Why a law firm? He'd asked, leaning against my desk with that grin of his. Because power isn't always loud, I'd said. And I meant it. I never bragged about money or flashed it around like Carter did with that ridiculous watch. I didn't need to. The kind of wealth I had didn't shout, it whispered, and it got things done. Lorraine had no idea. She'd strutted into that brunch spot yesterday, so smug, thinking she'd hired the best firm in the city to bury me. Winston & Bright wasn't just any firm. They were sharks, known for their scorched earth tactics, the kind of lawyers who dig up every receipt and old email to make you look like a monster. She probably thought it was perfect, a way to twist the knife and walk away with half of everything. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that every move they made, every strategy they cooked up, was happening under my roof. I owned them. The junior associate she'd probably charmed into taking her case? He worked for me. The fancy office she'd visited to sign the retainer? Mine. It was almost funny if it didn't sting so much. I picked up the phone and dialed Jules. He answered on the second ring, his voice easy like always. Hey, man, you holding up after yesterday? He asked. I could hear the clink of a coffee mug in the background. He was probably at his place, feet up, already digging into the day. Yeah, I said, keeping it simple. She hired Winston & Bright. There was a pause, then a low whistle. No kidding? You're firm. I could hear the grin in his voice now, and it made me smile despite everything. Yep, my firm. He laughed, short and sharp. She's got no clue, does she? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Not yet, but she will. We talked for a while, tossing ideas back and forth. Jules was my COO, the guy who kept the gears turning at the holding company I'd built from nothing. He knew the business inside out, knew every asset, every shadow move I'd made to grow it quietly over the years. The trust, the shell companies, the offshore accounts, he'd helped me set it all up, piece by piece. Lorraine thought I was just a guy with a decent job, maybe a few investments. She didn't know about the millions tucked away, the properties, the stakes in firms like Winston & Bright. I'd kept it that way on purpose. Flashy guys like Carter showed off because they had to prove something. Me? I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I hung up with Jules and pulled out the file on Winston & Bright. It wasn't thick, just a few pages detailing the acquisition, the ownership structure, the legal cover I'd put in place to keep my name off the public records. I bought it 5 years ago, back when Lorraine was still talking about starting a family, before things started to sour. The firm had been a smart move then, a way to diversify, to have a foothold in the legal world. Now it was a weapon, one she'd handed me without even realizing it. I flipped through the pages, my fingers brushing the edges, and felt a strange calm settle over me. She wanted to play dirty? Fine. I'd play smarter. The phone buzzed again. Elias Ward, my attorney. Miles, he said when I picked up, his voice all business. I got the heads up from Jules. Winston & Bright, huh? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah, she thinks she's got me cornered. Elias chuckled, dry and quick. She's in for a surprise. You want me to pull the plug now, or wait for court? I thought about it, picturing Lorraine's smirk again, the way she'd tossed her hair like she'd already won. Wait, I said. Let her walk in thinking she's got it all figured out. Then we drop it. He didn't argue. Elias was sharp, the kind of lawyer who didn't waste words. Got it. See you at the courthouse. I hung up and leaned back again, the city skyline stretching out beyond the glass. Lorraine thought this divorce was her chance to take me down, to walk away with everything I'd built. She didn't know the half of it, literally. The money she thought she'd get her hands on? That was just the surface, the stuff I let her see. The real wealth, the real power, was locked away where she'd never find it. And Winston and Bright? That was just the start. I closed the file, slid it back into the drawer, and locked it. Let her come at me with her lawyers and her new boyfriend. Let her think she was in control. I'd been building this empire for years, quiet and steady, and I wasn't about to let her, or anyone, tear it down. I woke up on court day with the kind of calm you feel before a storm hits, quiet, heavy, like the air knows something's coming. The divorce hearing was in a few hours, and I could already picture Lorraine strutting in, all polished and ready to take me apart. I got out of bed, the hardwood floor cold under my feet, and went through the motions. Shower, coffee, suit. Nothing fancy, just a charcoal jacket and pants, the kind I'd worn 100 times to meetings. I didn't need to show off, not today, not ever. This wasn't about looking good. It was about being ready. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie, and thought about how she'd probably spend hours picking her outfit, something sharp and expensive to match Carter's flashy style. That was her game. Mine was different. I grabbed my keys and headed out, the morning sun just starting to cut through the haze over the city. Jules was waiting for me at the courthouse. He'd texted earlier, saying he'd meet me there, no questions asked. That's how he was, always there when it mattered, no fuss. I drove in silence, no radio, just my thoughts bouncing around. I wasn't nervous, not exactly. I'd been in tough spots before, built my whole life from nothing, and this wasn't going to break me. Lorraine thought she had the upper hand with her fancy lawyers and her new boyfriend hanging off her arm like some trophy. She didn't know what I had waiting for her. When I pulled up to the courthouse, Jules was already there, leaning against a pillar outside, hands in his pockets. He grinned when he saw me, that easy smile that hadn't changed since we were kids. Looking sharp, Miles, he said, falling into step beside me as we headed up the steps. You ready to watch her squirm? I nodded, keeping my face steady. Yeah, let's just get it done. He clapped me on the shoulder, and we walked inside, the echo of our shoes on the marble floor mixing with the low hum of voices. The place smelled like old wood and paper, the kind of smell that sticks to you. People moved around us, lawyers with briefcases, clerks shuffling files, regular folks looking lost. I kept my eyes forward, focused. We found our courtroom, and I saw Lorraine before she saw me. She was standing near the front, wearing a sleek black power suit that probably cost more than my car payment. Carter was next to her, all broad shoulders and a grin that said he thought he'd already won. He had his arm around her waist, possessive, like she was his prize. She didn't even glance my way when I walked in, just tossed her hair and laughed at something he said, her voice cutting through the room. I felt a flicker of something. Anger, maybe, or just irritation, but I pushed it down. This wasn't the time. I took my seat on the defendant's side, Jules sliding in beside me, still grinning like he knew something she didn't. He did. We both did. Elias showed up a minute later, his suit crisp, his face all business. He set his briefcase on the table and started flipping through papers, barely looking up. Morning, he said, voice low. They're cocky. Good. Makes this easier. I nodded, watching him work. Elias was the best, sharp, no nonsense, the kind of guy who could cut through a lie with one question. I'd hired him years ago for a business deal, and now he was here, ready to turn Lorraine's plan inside out. He didn't care about the drama, just the facts, and that's what I needed today. Across the aisle, Lorraine's lawyer, a young guy named Braden Kell, was fussing with his notes, adjusting his tie like he was about to give a speech to a stadium. He had that eager look, like he thought this was his big break. Lorraine must have picked him because he was hungry, the type who'd fight dirty just to prove himself. She leaned over and whispered something to him, her hand brushing his arm, and he nodded, all puffed up. Carter sat back in his chair, legs spread wide, like he owned the place. I almost laughed. They had no idea what was coming. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice booming through the room. All rise for the Honorable Judge Miriam Calloway. Everyone stood, the rustle of clothes and papers filling the space. I straightened up, hands at my sides, watching as the judge walked in. She was older, maybe 60, with steel gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that didn't miss a thing. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and nodded at the bailiff. Be seated, she said, her voice firm, no room for nonsense. We all sat, and I felt Jules nudge me under the table, his grin still there. This was it. Judge Calloway looked over her papers, then up at the room. Case number 4721, Caldwell versus Knox, she said, her tone flat. Counsel, please identify yourselves. Elias stood first, buttoning his jacket. Elias Ward, representing Miles Knox, Your Honor. He sat back down, smooth and quick. Braden popped up next, flashing a smile that was too big for the room. Braden Kell, representing Lorraine Caldwell, Your Honor, with Winston and Bright LLP. He sat down, looking pleased with himself, like saying the firm's name was enough to win. I glanced at Lorraine. She was staring straight ahead, that smirk from brunch still lingering on her lips. Carter shifted beside her, checking his watch again, probably thinking this would be over fast. They thought they had me pinned, me, the boring husband who'd let her walk all over him for years. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my face blank. The courtroom felt smaller now, the air thicker, like everyone was holding their breath for what came next. Judge Calloway tapped her pen once, twice, then set it down. She looked at me, then at Braden, then back at me. I met her eyes and waited. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to blink. The courtroom was buzzing with that low hum you get when everyone's waiting for something to happen, but they don't know what. I sat there, hands resting on the table, watching Lorraine across the aisle. She was leaning toward Braden, whispering something, her fingers tapping the edge of her chair like she couldn't wait to get this over with. Carter sat next to her, slouched back, one arm draped over the seat like he was at a ball game, not a divorce hearing. I could feel Jules beside me, his energy all coiled up, ready to see this play out. Elias was still flipping through his papers, calm as ever, like he'd done this 1,000 times. He had. But this time was different. This time, I had the ace up my sleeve. Braden stood up, smoothing his jacket, that cocky grin plastered on his face. Your Honor, he started, his voice loud, like he wanted the whole room to hear how sure he was. I'm here today representing Lorraine Caldwell in what we believe is a straightforward case. My client has endured years of emotional neglect from Mr. Knox, a man who prioritized his work over their marriage. We're seeking a fair division of assets, including half of his reported income and properties, as well as spousal support to ensure Mrs. Caldwell can maintain the lifestyle she's accustomed to. He paused, glancing at Lorraine like she'd coached him on that line. She nodded, her smirk growing, and Carter gave a little snort, like it was all so obvious. I didn't move, didn't flinch. Just watched him lay out his opening, piling up words like they were bricks in a wall he thought I couldn't climb. Emotional neglect, funny how she spun that one. I'd spent years keeping our life steady, paying the bills, building something solid, while she'd started drifting, chasing whatever caught her eye. Now it was Carter, with his gym muscles and that watch he kept flashing. Braden kept going, tossing out numbers, my salary, the house, some savings account she'd dug up, like he'd already won. I let him talk. The more he said, the better this was going to feel. Then Judge Calloway raised her hand, just a small lift, but it stopped Braden mid-sentence. He froze, mouth half open, like a kid caught talking in class. The room went dead quiet, every eye on her. She adjusted her glasses, peering over them at me, then at Braden, then back at me again. I met her gaze, steady, not giving anything away. She tapped her pen once on the desk, the sound sharp in the silence, and leaned forward. Mr. Knox, she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. As the registered majority owner of Winston and Bright LLP, would you like to proceed with allowing this representation to continue? It was like someone dropped a bomb in the room, and the blast just hung there, silent and heavy. Braden's face went slack, his papers slipping a little in his hands. Lorraine's head snapped toward me, her smirk gone, replaced by wide eyes and a mouth that couldn't decide whether to close or drop open more. Carter sat up straight, blinking fast, and muttered, "Wait, what? Does that mean they're disqualified or something?" His voice sounded small, confused, like he'd wandered into the wrong movie. Jules nudged me under the table, and I could feel his grin without even looking. Elias didn't react, just kept his eyes on his notes, but I saw the tiniest twitch at the corner of his mouth. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and looked right at Judge Calloway. "No, Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice even, calm. "I'd like to withdraw their representation. Effective immediately." The words landed like stones, solid and final. Braden made a choking sound, like he'd swallowed his own tongue, and Lorraine shot up from her chair, her hands slamming down on the table. "What?" she yelled, loud enough that the bailiff took a step forward. "That's not, he can't do that." Her face was red now, all that polished confidence cracking apart. Judge Calloway didn't blink. She just turned her head slightly toward Lorraine, those sharp eyes locking on her. "Mrs. Caldwell, sit down," she said, her tone flat but firm. Lorraine hesitated, then dropped back into her seat, glaring at me like she could burn a hole through my skull. Braden was flipping through his notes now, frantic, muttering something under his breath. Carter leaned over to Lorraine, whispering, "What's he talking about?" "He owns them." She didn't answer, just kept staring at me, her chest rising and falling fast. I sat back, letting the moment sink in. I could have told her years ago about Winston and Bright, about how I'd bought it quietly, tucked it into my holdings like a card I didn't need to play yet. But I didn't. I never bragged, never flaunted it. She thought I was just some guy who moved money around, boring and predictable. Now she was finding out the hard way that I'd been playing a bigger game all along. Judge Calloway tapped her pen again, looking at Braden. "Counselor, do you have anything to say?" He stammered, pushing his hair back with a shaky hand. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. I wasn't informed. My firm didn't disclose." She cut him off with a look. "Mr. Kell, your firm's ownership isn't my concern. Mr. Knox has the legal right to terminate representation as the majority stakeholder, provided it aligns with ethical standards. We'll address that shortly. For now, I suggest you sit down." Braden sank into his chair, looking like a kid who just lost his lunch money. The room stayed quiet, everyone waiting for what came next. Lorraine's eyes were still on me, burning with questions she didn't dare ask out loud yet. Carter shifted, uncomfortable, like he was starting to realize he'd picked the wrong team. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, just sat there, letting them stew. This was the moment I'd waited for, the one I'd set up years ago without even knowing it had come to this. She'd walked in thinking she'd destroy me, but I'd already turned her weapon into mine. And we weren't done yet. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath after Judge Calloway's words settled over us. I sat there, hands folded on the table, watching Lorraine unravel across the aisle. She'd shot up again, ignoring the judge's order to sit, her voice shrill as she pointed at me. "This isn't legal. He's sabotaging me. You can't just let him do this." Her hair was slipping out of its perfect twist, strands falling around her face, and her hands were shaking. Braden grabbed at her arm, trying to pull her back down, his face pale and sweaty. "Lorraine, please," he hissed, but she yanked away, glaring at me like I'd set her whole world on fire. Maybe I had. Carter just sat there, blinking, his big shoulders slumped like he didn't know what to do with himself. "Babe, what's happening?" he mumbled, loud enough for me to hear. She didn't answer, just kept staring at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. I didn't move, didn't say a word. I just looked back at her, calm and steady, letting her feel the weight of what she'd walked into. Judge Calloway cleared her throat, sharp and loud, and Lorraine finally dropped back into her seat, but her glare never left me. The judge adjusted her glasses and turned to Braden. "Mr. Kell, I assume you have an explanation for why your client seems so surprised by this?" Braden fumbled with his papers, his tie crooked now, his confidence gone. "Your Honor, Mrs. Caldwell wasn't aware of Mr. Knox's ownership. Neither was I. There's been no disclosure, no conflict check." That Judge Calloway cut him off, her voice like steel. "That's your firm's problem, not mine. Mr. Knox has the right to withdraw representation as the majority owner, provided it doesn't breach ethical constraints. Let's address that now." She flipped a page in front of her, scanning it quick. Mrs. Caldwell's intake form with Winston and Bright. Did she disclose her prior relationship with the defendant? Braden froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Lorraine snapped her head toward him, her voice low but furious. "What's she talking about? I told you everything." He swallowed hard, turning to her. "You said you didn't mention he owned the firm. You just said you were married to him." Lorraine's face went white, then red again. "I didn't know he owned it. How was I supposed to know that?" Her voice cracked, and Carter shifted in his seat, looking at her like she'd just grown a second head. Judge Calloway didn't flinch. She just kept her eyes on Braden. "So she failed to disclose a potential conflict, and your firm failed to identify it. That makes this simple. Representation is disqualified due to the omission on the intake form. Mr. Knox's withdrawal stands." She tapped her pen once, final, like a hammer hitting a nail. Lorraine exploded again, slamming her hands on the table. "I didn't lie. I picked your firm because it was the best, not because of him. He's twisting this. He's cheating." The bailiff took another step forward, but Judge Calloway waved him off, her face hard. "Mrs. Caldwell, control yourself, or I'll have you removed." I leaned back in my chair, feeling Jules nudge me again, his grin wide now. Elias scribbled something on his notepad, still cool as ice. Across the aisle, Lorraine was falling apart, and I could see it in her eyes, She was starting to realize she'd misjudged me. Bad. She'd picked Winston and Bright because she thought it was some big, unbeatable machine that had crushed me in court. She didn't know it was mine, didn't know I'd bought it years ago, back when she was still smiling at me across the dinner table. I'd never told her, not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't need to. She'd always laughed at my boring work, never asked about the details. Now those details were biting her back. Braden tried to recover, standing up again, his voice shaky. Your Honor, this puts my client at a severe disadvantage. We request a continuance to secure new counsel. Judge Calloway didn't even look at him, just kept writing something. Request noted. But Mrs. Caldwell chose her representation, and she'll live with the consequences of that choice today. We proceed with what's on the table. Braden sank back down, defeated, and Lorraine turned to me, her voice low and venomous. You planned this, didn't you? You set me up. I met her eyes, kept my face blank. No, Lorraine. You set yourself up. It was the first thing I'd said since the bombshell dropped, and it hit her like a slap. She flinched, then turned away, muttering something to Braden I couldn't hear. Carter leaned over again, whispering, So what now? She's got no lawyer. Lorraine shoved him back, snapping, Shut up, Carter. He recoiled, looking lost, and I almost felt bad for him. Almost. The judge moved on, calling Elias up to present my side. He stood, smooth and steady, laying out a simple defense. Our marriage had ended, I'd provided for her, and her claims of neglect were exaggerated. No fireworks, just facts. Lorraine didn't have much to fight back with now, not without Braden scrambling beside her. I watched her the whole time, saw the panic creeping in, the way her hands twisted together in her lap. She'd walked in here thinking she'd walk out with half my life in her pocket. Now she was stuck, no lawyer, no plan, just her and Carter staring at a wall they couldn't climb. When Elias sat down, Judge Calloway looked at Lorraine. Mrs. Caldwell, you're welcome to represent yourself for the remainder of this hearing, or we can adjourn after Mr. Knox's counsel finishes. Your call. Lorraine didn't answer right away, just glared at me, then at the judge, then back at me. Finally, she muttered, I need time. The judge nodded. Very well. Hearing adjourned until tomorrow, 9 a.m. Get your house in order. She banged a gavel, and the room exhaled. I stood up, buttoning my jacket, and Jules clapped me on the back. That was beautiful, man, he said, laughing low. I didn't smile, just nodded and headed for the door. Lorraine was still sitting there as I passed, her eyes burning into me. I didn't look back. She'd figure out soon enough that this wasn't sabotage, it was just me playing the hand I'd been holding all along. I walked out of the courtroom with Jules at my side, the echo of Judge Calloway's gavel still ringing in my ears. The hallway was busy, people shuffling past, lawyers barking into phones, clerks hauling stacks of files, but it felt like the world had slowed down just for me. Lorraine was back there, scrambling, probably yelling at Braden or Carter or anyone who'd listen, but I didn't care. I'd done what I needed to do, flipped her whole game upside down, and now she was stuck. No lawyer, no plan, just her own mess staring her in the face. Jules nudged me as we hit the stairs, his voice low and amused. She's gonna lose it out there, man. You see her face when the judge shut her down. I nodded, keeping my eyes forward. Yeah, she didn't see it coming. Outside, the air was crisp, the kind of March chill that wakes you up. I stopped on the courthouse steps, hands in my pockets, and took a deep breath. Jules leaned against the railing, grinning like a kid who'd just won a bet. What's next? She's got no one to fight for her now, thinks she'll cave. I shrugged, watching cars roll by on the street below. Maybe. Depends how stubborn she wants to be. He laughed, short and sharp. Stubborn's her middle name. But she's got no moves left. You've got her cornered. He was right. Lorraine was out of options. After Judge Calloway disqualified Winston and Bright, she tried calling other firms right there in the courthouse lobby. I'd seen her on her phone as I walked out, pacing, her voice rising with every word. But word travels fast in this city. No decent lawyer was going to jump into a case that had just blown up like that, not with her screaming at staff and Carter heckling the bailiff like some drunk fan at a game. She dug her own hole, and now she was standing in it, alone. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Back at my office, I sat down with Elias to figure out the next step. He was already at the table when I got there, his jacket off, sleeves rolled up, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. She's got until tomorrow morning, he said, not looking up from his laptop. But she's not going to find anyone good in that time. Best she'll get is some bottom feeder who'll take her money and flail. I sat across from him, loosening my tie. What's our play? He tapped a few keys, then slid a folder over to me. We offer her a settlement. Clean, simple, fair. She signs, we're done. She fights, she loses more. I opened the folder, numbers, terms, a breakdown of what I was willing to give her. It wasn't half, not even close, but it was enough to keep her quiet, let her walk away with something. The house, some cash, a little piece of what she thought she deserved. The real stuff, my holdings, the trusts, the offshore accounts, that was untouchable, locked up where she'd never find it. Elias leaned back, sipping his coffee. She'll hate it, but she's got no leverage. Judge Calloway's already pissed. She threatened sanctions if Lorraine wastes more time tomorrow. I nodded, flipping through the pages. Think she'll take it? He smirked, just a little. She won't want to. But she's not stupid. Once she calms down, she'll see it's her only out. I closed the folder and slid it back. Draft it up. Let's get it to her today. Elias didn't argue, just got to work, his fingers flying over the keyboard. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city stretching below. This was it, the end of 12 years, wrapped up in a few sheets of paper. It didn't feel like a win, not yet. Just a step. Later that afternoon, Elias sent the settlement offer to Lorraine's email, her personal one, since she didn't have a lawyer to handle it now. I pictured her opening it, sitting in that big house we used to share, Carter probably hovering nearby, confused and useless. She'd read it, fume, maybe throw something. But she'd have to face reality eventually. I wasn't budging, and she didn't have the firepower to make me. By evening, I got a call from Elias. She responded, he said, his voice flat. Says it's insulting, wants double. I told her no dice, take it or see us in court tomorrow. I wasn't surprised. Lorraine always pushed, always wanted more. What did she say to that? I asked, leaning against my desk. Elias chuckled, dry and quick. She hung up. But she's rattled. Give her a few hours, she'll crack. I hung up and poured myself a glass of water, staring at the bubbles rising in it. She could fight all she wanted, but the clock was ticking, and Judge Calloway wasn't playing games. Sanctions meant fines, maybe worse, and Lorraine didn't have the cash to throw around like that, not without me. The next morning, I was back in the courtroom, Jules beside me, Elias at the table. Lorraine walked in late, no lawyer, just Carter trailing behind her like a lost puppy. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, her suit wrinkled, like she hadn't slept. Judge Calloway didn't waste time. Mrs. Caldwell, I assume you're representing yourself? Lorraine nodded, her jaw tight. Yes, Your Honor. The judge raised an eyebrow. Very well. Mr. Ward, proceed. Elias stood, laying out the settlement offer again, calm and clear. Lorraine tried to interrupt, rambling about how I'd tricked her, how it wasn't fair, but Calloway shut her down fast. Enough, she said, her voice like a whip. You've had time to prepare. This isn't a soap opera. Accept the offer, or we move forward, and I'll be adding sanctions for delaying my docket. Lorraine went quiet, her hands clenched, and I saw the fight drain out of her. She signed the papers, her pen scratching hard against the page, her face bitter and furious. Carter walked out before she did, not even waiting. I watched her go, the door swinging shut behind her. It was over. She'd lost, and she knew it. I didn't feel like cheering. Just stood there, letting it sink in. She'd come at me with everything she had, and I'd turned it all back on her. Now she was gone, and I was still standing. I left the courthouse that morning with the settlement signed and Lorraine out of my life for good. The air outside felt lighter, like the weight of the last few months had finally lifted off my shoulders. Jules walked beside me, hands in his pockets, whistling some tune I didn't recognize. You did it, man, he said, glancing at me with that grin of his. She's gone, and you're still standing. How's it feel? I shrugged, stepping down onto the sidewalk. Doesn't feel like much yet. Just done. He nodded, like he got it, and we headed to my car in silence. The city hummed around us, horns honking, people rushing by, but I was in my own head, replaying the last few days, the look on Lorraine's face when she signed those papers, bitter and beaten. Back at my office, I shut the door and sat at my desk, the quiet wrapping around me like a blanket. The case file was still there, a thick stack of papers Elias had left behind. I pulled it over and flipped it open, not sure why, just needing to see it one last time. Lorraine had tried everything, dug up old text messages where I'd said I'd be late from work, bank records from accounts she thought were the whole story, anything she could twist into emotional neglect. I read through a few, dry, short messages about meetings and deadlines, stuff she'd ignored back then but now tried to use against me. It was almost funny how desperate she'd gotten, but it didn't matter. Those were just the decoys, the surface stuff I let her see. The real assets, the millions, the properties, the stakes in firms like Winston and Bright were buried deep, locked in blind trust with Jules running the show. She never had a chance. I closed the file and leaned back, staring out the window at the skyline. The sun was dipping low now, painting the buildings gold and orange. I thought about how she'd walked in with Carter, so sure she'd take me down, and walked out alone, her boyfriend bailing the second it got hard. That's who she'd picked over me, some guy who couldn't even stick around when the going got tough. I didn't feel angry, though. Not anymore. I just felt free. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for years and finally set it down. Lorraine thought she knew me, thought I was just a boring guy who'd let her walk away with everything. She didn't know half of it, and now she never would. My phone buzzed on the desk, pulling me out of my thoughts. A text from Lorraine. Just one line. How long have you owned them? I stared at it, the words glowing on the screen, her voice practically jumping out of them. She meant Winston and Bright, of course. She was still reeling, still trying to figure out how I'd pulled it off. I could have answered. Told her I'd bought it 5 years ago, back when she was still pretending we had a future, back when I was building something bigger than she could imagine. But I didn't. I set the phone down, face up, and let it sit there, unanswered. She didn't deserve an explanation. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. I got up and poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the shelf, the coolness of it steadying me. The office was empty now. Jules had gone home. Elias was off doing whatever lawyers do after a win. It was just me and the hum of the building, the faint sounds of traffic filtering up from the street. I walked back to the window, glass in hand, and thought about what came next. This wasn't a victory lap. I didn't need to gloat or throw a party. That wasn't me. Lorraine had come at me with everything she had, and I'd turned it back on her without breaking a sweat. That was enough. I sipped the water, letting it roll down my throat, and remembered the early days with her, back when we were young, broke, figuring it out. She'd been different then, softer, laughing at my dumb jokes, curling up next to me on that ratty couch we'd found on the curb. Somewhere along the way, she'd changed, or maybe I just stopped seeing her clearly. Either way, it was over now. The divorce was final, the settlement locked in, and she was out of my life. I didn't need to look back, didn't need to wonder what could have been. I'd built something solid, something mine, and she couldn't touch it. The phone buzzed again, another message from her. I didn't check it, just turned it face down and left it there. Whatever she had to say, it didn't matter anymore. I finished the water and set the glass on the desk, then grabbed my jacket. The day was done, and I was ready to go home, not to the house we'd shared, but to the apartment I'd moved into a few months back, small and simple, just mine. I locked the office door behind me and took the elevator down, the soft ding of each floor marking the end of something. Out on the street, the air was cooler now, the city settling into night. I walked to my car, hands in my pockets, feeling lighter than I had in months. Lorraine's question echoed in my head. How long have you owned them? But I pushed it away. She'd find out eventually, maybe dig around and piece it together, but by then it'd be too late. I'd already moved on. The engine purred when I started the car, and I pulled out into traffic, the lights blurring past. This wasn't the end of my story, just the end of hers in it. And that was fine by me. I woke up the next morning in my new apartment, the sunlight slipping through the blinds and hitting the bare walls. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom place with a small kitchen and a view of the street, but it was mine, and that felt good. No trace of Lorraine here, no echoes of her voice or her stuff cluttering up the space. I got out of bed, the floor cool under my feet, and made coffee, the machine gurgling as I stood there in sweatpants and a t-shirt. The divorce was done, the papers signed, and now it was just me. I didn't feel like celebrating. Not the way Jules probably expected, with drinks and loud laughs. That wasn't my style. I just wanted to keep moving, keep building. I took my coffee to the table, a little wooden thing I'd picked up cheap, and sat down, staring out the window. The city was waking up, cars rolling by, people heading to work. I thought about the last few days, the courtroom, Lorraine's meltdown, the way she'd signed that settlement with her jaw tight and her eyes spitting fire. She'd lost, and I'd walked away whole. But it didn't feel like a big win, not yet. It was more like a door closing, quiet and final, leaving me on this side with a clean slate. I sipped the coffee, strong and black, and let that sink in. A clean slate. I could do anything now. By noon, I was at the office, sitting with Elias and Jules in the conference room. The air smelled like printer ink and the sandwiches we'd ordered in. Elias was still riding the high of the hearing, his tie loosened, a rare smile tugging at his face. "We should have seen her face when you pulled the plug on Winston and Bright," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Priceless." Jules laughed, biting into his turkey sub. "She thought she had you, man. Thought she'd walk out with your whole life in her purse." I nodded, picking at my own sandwich. Yeah, she didn't know what she was up against. We talked business after that, real business, not just the divorce mess. I'd been thinking about the firm, Winston and Bright, ever since the hearing. It was mine, sure, but it didn't feel right keeping it under that name, tied to the old guard and Lorraine's failed play. "I want to rename it," I said, looking at Elias. "Knox and Rivera. Clean it up, shift the focus." He raised an eyebrow, setting his coffee down. "You serious? That's a big move." Jules grinned, leaning forward. "Hell yeah, he's serious. My name on a law firm? I'm in." I smirked a little. First time I'd felt like smiling in days. "It's not just about the name. We take it into tech litigation, philanthropy cases. Make it ours." Elias didn't argue, just nodded, already thinking it through. "I like it. Fresh start, new direction." "I'm in too." I promoted him to partner right there, no hesitation. He'd earned it, sticking with me through the chaos, turning Lorraine's attack into nothing. We shook hands, and Jules clapped us both on the back, laughing. "Knox and Rivera. Sounds like a powerhouse already." It did. It felt right, something solid, something I could build on, with the two guys I trusted most. We spent the afternoon sketching it out, new branding, new cases, a quiet nod to where we'd started, me and Jules, scraping by with nothing but big ideas. Later that week, Lorraine texted again. I was at my desk, going through emails, when it popped up. "I'm sorry, Miles. I didn't mean for it to get this bad." I stared at it, the words sitting there like they wanted something from me. An apology after everything she'd pulled. I didn't feel angry, though. Didn't feel much at all. She'd made her choices, Carter, the divorce, the courtroom tantrums, and I'd made mine. I didn't know her a response, didn't know her anything. I deleted the message and kept working, the hum of the office filling the silence. The days turned into weeks, and I settled into the new rhythm. Knox and Rivera took shape. Elias brought in a tech startup case, some small company fighting a patent grab by a bigger fish, and we won it clean. I liked that, helping the little guy, the ones who reminded me of myself way back when. I started spending less time at the office, though, letting Jules and Elias steer the ship. I needed space, time to figure out who I was without Lorraine's shadow hanging over me. I wasn't hiding, not like before, when I kept my wealth quiet to avoid the spotlight. I was just shifting. One night, I was at the apartment, cooking dinner, nothing fancy, just chicken and rice in a pan. The smell filled the place, warm and simple, and I realized I hadn't cooked like this in years. Lorraine always wanted takeout or restaurants, something to show off. This was better. I ate at the table, the TV off, just me and the quiet. It hit me then. I wasn't mad at her anymore. She tried to take me down, and I'd come out stronger. Not because I'd beaten her, but because I'd let her go. I didn't need to prove anything, didn't need her approval or her regret. I was done. I cleaned up, the clink of dishes in the sink grounding me, and looked around the place. Bare walls, a few boxes still unpacked, but it was starting to feel like home. I didn't need much, just enough to keep going. The firm was growing, my life was mine again, and Lorraine was a memory fading fast. I turned off the lights and headed to bed, the city buzzing outside. This was the rebuild, slow and steady, and I was good with that. I stood on the porch of the lake house I'd bought upstate, the early morning air cool and sharp against my skin. It was a few months after the divorce, and the city felt like a lifetime ago. The water stretched out in front of me, flat and quiet, reflecting the trees turning red and gold. I'd found this place on a whim. A small, weathered cabin with a dock and a view that made you forget the noise of everything else. It wasn't fancy, nothing like the big house Lorraine and I used to share, but that's why I liked it. No pretension, no ghosts. Just me and the stillness. I sipped my coffee, the mug warm in my hands, and let the peace settle in. This was the real win. Not the courtroom, not the settlement, just this. The weeks after the hearing had blurred together, setting up Knox and Rivera, tying up loose ends, moving on. I'd started coming up here on weekends, then stretching it into days at a time. I'd unpack a little more each trip, some books, a chair, a frying pan, and it was starting to feel like mine. I'd even learned to cook again, real stuff, not just the quick meals I'd thrown together in the apartment. Last night, I'd made a stew, chopping carrots and potatoes with a knife that had seen better days, the smell filling the cabin until it felt alive. Lorraine would have hated it. Too simple, too messy, but that didn't matter anymore. I was figuring out who I was without her, and it felt good. Back in the city, I'd started mentoring some young founders, kids with big ideas and no money, the way Jules and I used to be. I'd meet them at a coffee shop downtown, listen to their pitches, give them pointers on how to grow without getting crushed. They reminded me of myself at that age, hungry, scrappy, scared but too stubborn to quit. One guy, a wiry kid named Sam, had a plan for a tech app that could help small farmers track crops. I hooked him up with Elias for the legal side, gave him a little seed cash from my own pocket. Watching him light up, talking fast about his next steps, made me feel something I hadn't in a while. Useful, maybe even proud. I wasn't hiding anymore, wasn't keeping everything locked up tight. I was living. I set the mug down on the railing and walked to the edge of the dock, the boards creaking under my boots. The water lapped soft against the posts, and I thought about Jules asking me that question a few weeks back. We'd been at the office, late, going over some new case files, when he'd leaned back in his chair and said, "You ever regret marrying her?" I'd paused, surprised he'd even ask. Lorraine's face flashed in my mind, her smirk at brunch, her panic in court, but it didn't sting like it used to. No, I told him, meeting his eyes. She showed me exactly who I didn't want to become. He nodded, like he got it, and we'd moved on. No big moment, just the truth. Out here, that answer felt even truer. Lorraine had pushed me, hard, and I'd come out the other side sharper, clearer. She'd wanted flash, control, a life where she could show off and feel big. I'd wanted steady, real, something I could stand on. That's why I'd built what I had, quietly, piece by piece, not for applause but for myself. She tried to take it, thinking it was hers to claim, and I'd let her think she could, right up until I shut it down. But it wasn't about beating her, not really. It was about knowing who I was, what I'd made, and holding on to it. This lake house, the firm, the kids I was helping, that was the win. Not her walking away empty-handed. I headed back inside, the screen door banging shut behind me. The cabin was small, wood walls, a stone fireplace, a couch I'd hauled up in my truck. I'd left the city chaos behind, but I wasn't running. I still went back for meetings, still checked in with Jules and Elias, but this was my anchor now. I grabbed a book off the shelf, some old novel I'd found in a used shop, and settled into the couch, the fire crackling low. The words blurred a little as I read, my mind drifting back to those early days with Lorraine, when we'd been broke and hopeful, before she'd started chasing something else. I didn't miss her, not the way I thought I might. I missed the idea of us, maybe, but that was long gone. Later, Jules came up for the weekend. He pulled in Saturday afternoon, his car kicking up dust on the dirt road, and hopped out with a six-pack and a grin. "Nice spot," he said, looking around as we sat on the porch. "You going hermit on me?" I laughed, cracking open a beer. "Nah, just breathing." We talked about the firm. Knox and Rivera was picking up steam, more cases, a reputation that was starting to turn heads. He asked if I'd heard from Lorraine, and I shook my head. "Not since that apology text." "She's done." He nodded, sipping his beer. "Good. You don't need that noise." We stayed out there till the sun dipped below the trees, the lake going dark and still. Jules was right. I didn't need the noise. I'd spent years building in the shadows, keeping it quiet, and now I could step into the light on my terms. The real win wasn't the money or the firm or even outsmarting Lorraine. It was this clarity, peace, a life that fit. I leaned back in my chair, the night settling in, and felt whole. That was enough. I sat in the back of a courtroom a year later, the wooden bench hard under me, the air thick with that familiar smell of old paper and tension. It wasn't my case this time, just a wrongful termination suit, some single mom named Tara going up against a big corporation that had fired her for no good reason. She had Elias representing her, and I'd come to watch, quiet, keeping to myself. The room was half full, lawyers, a few reporters, regular folks like me who didn't stand out. I leaned back, arms crossed, and watched Elias work. He was sharp as ever, laying out Tara's story, how she'd been let go after asking for time off to care for her sick kid, how the company tried to bury her with paperwork and lies. She sat there, small but steady, her hands folded tight in her lap. The hearing went fast. Elias had the evidence locked down, emails, timestamps, a manager's slip-up in a deposition, and the other side didn't have much to fight back with. The judge, a younger guy with a tired face, ruled quick. Tara won, full back pay, and her job if she wanted it. She didn't smile, not right away, just nodded, like she couldn't believe it was real. I stayed in my seat as the room started to clear, watching her shake Elias's hand, her voice soft but strong. "Thank you," she said, then turned and saw me. She walked over, hesitant, her eyes searching mine. "You're Mr. Knox, right? Elias said you made this possible." I nodded, keeping it simple. "Just helped out where I could." She smiled then, small but real. "Thank you," she said again, and headed out, her steps a little lighter. I stayed there a minute, letting the quiet sink in. Elias came over, loosening his tie. "Good day," he said, sitting next to me. "She deserved that win." I agreed, watching the last few people file out. "Yeah, glad we could do it." He didn't push, just sat there with me, the courtroom emptying around us. This was what Knox and Rivera was now. Cases like Tara's, people who needed a hand, not just big clients with deep pockets. It felt right, like the firm was finally what I'd wanted it to be. I'd started it with Jules years ago, built it quiet and steady, and now it was something more. Not loud, not flashy, just solid. I thought about Lorraine as I sat there, how she'd come at me in this same kind of room, thinking she'd tear me down. She'd walked in with her smirk and her fancy lawyers, so sure she'd walk out with half my life. But I'd already won before she even stepped through the door. Won because I'd built something she couldn't touch, something bigger than her games. That day felt far away now, like a story that happened to someone else. I didn't hate her, didn't even think about her much. She'd faded into the background, her and Carter and all their noise, while I kept going, step by step. I left the courthouse and drove up to the lake house that night, the road dark and winding, the stars sharp overhead. The cabin was waiting for me, same as always, wood walls, the faint smell of pine, the couch I'd worn in over months of quiet nights. I dropped my keys on the table and started a fire, the crackle filling the silence. It had been a year since the divorce, a year since I'd turned her attack into my freedom, and I'd spent it building something new. The firm, the mentoring, this place. It was all mine, shaped by my hands, not hers. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Didn't need the world to know my name. Tara knew, Sam the tech kid knew, Jules and Elias knew. That was enough. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat by the fire, the warmth seeping into me. The lake was out there, dark and still, a mirror for the sky. I thought about how I'd gotten here, from nothing, scraping by with Jules, to this. Lorraine had been part of it, sure, but she'd never understood it. She saw money, status, things to show off. I saw roots, something to stand on. That's why I'd bought Winston and Bright all those years ago, why I'd tucked my wealth away in trusts and shells. Not to hide, but to protect, to make sure no one could take it from me. She tried, and I'd let her think she could, right up until I pulled the rug out. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and I took a sip of the beer, cold and bitter. I didn't regret her, not the way people might expect. She pushed me to see what I was made of, forced me to draw a line and hold it. Without her, maybe I'd still be coasting, letting life happen. Now I was here, in this cabin, with a firm that mattered and a life that fit. Full circle, back to me, but better. I didn't need her to lose for me to win. I'd won by letting her go, by building something she couldn't break. I finished the beer and set the bottle down, leaning back into the couch. The night stretched out, quiet and deep, and I felt it, liberation, real and simple. Not many people knew who I was, not the full story. Not the kid who'd started with nothing, not the guy who'd outsmarted his ex in a courtroom, not the man sitting here now, whole and free. And that was how I liked it. I closed my eyes, the fire's glow warm on my face, and let the peace take over. She'd come to court thinking she'd destroy me, but I'd already won before she even walked through the door.